And I went to go and see a vet to watch her working. And I was fascinated by the way that this vet was able to very quickly ascertain what the mental experience of the animal was. In other words, was it hungry? Was it tired? Was it frightened? Did it need to control its environment? Did it need to submit? Yeah? And she was then able, very, very quickly, because if she wasn't quick, she'd miss her opportunity, to then make contact with that animal. That is what we have lost with making everything so procedural and explicit, that we have lost our imaginative contact with the people that come to us. Very often, it's not what is being said, it is what is not being said that holds the key to good contact and good understanding. Brief example. A child is brought in, according to the records, a child is brought in by its mother with serial complaints of upper respiratory tract or fever or not feeling very well or vomited over the weekend or whatever, right? And there are all these records. And I think, what's going on here? And then, being seen by other doctors, and then I see a constellation comes in, like a tableau, and there is this very healthy looking toddler in a pushchair, looking around the room and bright-eyed and looks to me very healthy. A mother who is apprehensive and looking at the child and then looking behind her at her own mother, right? So you've got the child, the toddler in the pushchair, the mother standing behind her, and then her mother standing behind her is looking grim and preoccupied. And I think, what is going on here? And I think this is not just about a child who has a minor illness. It is not just about minor serial illnesses. There is something else going on. So I ask a few questions, and I establish that, to begin with, the grandmother is saying the child can't go on like this. We keep on bringing the child back. He keeps on being ill. He's feverish again, and so on. Yeah. If we don't get him any better, we're going up the hospital. When I scratch beneath the surface, what do I find? But the grandmother tells me a story, and the story is that when she was a small girl living in Norfolk, she had a sister who had a feverish illness, and the doctor was called and said there was nothing wrong with the child, and the fever went on. The doctor was called again and said nothing wrong, and eventually the child got very ill, the sister got very ill and developed meningitis and was very brain damaged and never came out of an institution, was made blind and deaf and unable to walk and so on. And that little girl had turned into a very crippled woman who'd lived all her life in an institution. And the grandmother clearly could, each time she was dealing with an ill grandchild, all of that was coming back. But it needed imagination to get there. And that is not possible. It's not possible to get to that sort of thing by procedures, by templates, or even by any kind of training. You have to open up people's imagination and interest, yes, and fresh observation. And all of that is being driven out. That's one of the things I go on about in my book. My writing is much more political now, and it's about what is being lost. I feel a lot of grief and rage about what is happening. And one way in which I feel I remain on the healthy side of that is to try to do something positive about it rather than to retreat into a melancholic sulk. So I try to change things, although I think I probably won't. I think I'm an idealistic pessimist.
So you cope by creating your own extraordinary language. Which is rich in the very things that are missing in the NHS.
I'm trying to convey, for me, my experience of the complex thoughts and feelings that I have in trying to understand and make contact with people. Yeah? And to do that, I cannot manage it if I'm restricted by a formulaic vocabulary. Yeah? Because the world that I live in is very, very complex. And I cannot have a committee deciding to tell me, I can't tolerate it anyway, that all the varieties of common unhappiness should be confined to a mere, say, 10 words of technical language. If you take, for example, the word depression, which of course is much used now, it's used instead of all kinds of words, and has now replaced all kinds of words that convey things that are much more subtle and meaningful, right? Rage, alienation, grief, sorrow, estrangement, ennui, resentment. Yeah, just a few. Yeah. Now, all of those things, psychiatrists now will hardly ever talk in those terms, because what do? They convert it all into depression. That is a terrible loss for me. And what I've tried to do is to put those words back into our workplace. We have adopted an industrial model to deliver healthcare. And that has really, first of all, it's chopped things up. And the other thing is it has attempted to make unnecessary either the narration or the understanding of stories. Everything becomes a separate episode. Everything becomes a separate procedure. And our current ways of trying to break things down are trying to make the human connection unimportant. Yes, in a way that is the aim of proceduralization. And in a way, you can argue that is one of the curses of excess science, because science only deals with the generic. It cannot deal with the personal. It can't deal with personal meaning, science. Right? So any scheme that attempts to be very procedural and very scientific will eventually destroy the human meaning. This is something I wrote for a psychology magazine. It's called Understanding the Other, 4 Elemental Questions for Therapeutic Psychology. And I talk about the way in which we've restricted the language. And this is a young man who has difficulties, all right? So this is how the NHS would often talk, and healthcare increasingly will talk about this sort of thing. T has a long history of recurrent agitated depressive illness with anxiety, panic reactions. He has a poor record of maintaining work and long-term relationships. He also has problems with anger management. This was evident to the clinic staff when I was unavoidably delayed. The inconvenience was clearly explained to T, who nevertheless was unacceptably angry and rude to staff in response. It is thus likely that T also has a personality disorder. Okay, that's quite typical of the kind of language we have now. Now here's another way of looking at it, which is much preferable to me and what I've always tried to cleave to. T has never recovered from the childhood terror and sorrow of his experience of his father's raging cruelty, brutality, and then final desertion. T's life has been spent yearning for, but mistrusting, male support, esteem, affection, and affiliation. My lateness for his appointment seems to stir in him intolerable ancient residues of vulnerability, uncertainty, and abandonment. His response to my greeting is staccato, flushed, and tense. He seems angry and afraid. I sense a conflation of fight and flight, and I think again of his wounded early childhood. I think it conveys something quite different, and we've lost that language. Okay.
And it has a huge effect on what happens next, doesn't it?
Yes, and eventually I will be on the receiving end of it, and that's
Yes.
another reason why I don't give up. I really fear getting old now. I wouldn't have done years ago. Of course, there were bad doctors 30 years ago, what I call the DSRs, duffers, slackers and rotters, right? Okay. There were a lot of those in the old days, and they are often caught out. But now the problem is that the institutions themselves have become rotten. It's not the practitioners, it's the institutions. It's fascinating. The problem is if you're not allowed to ever get to know anybody, how can you want to look out for them? You can't. Yeah. So if you have great big practices of 10 doctors and they're all part-time and they don't have designated lists, how on earth do they ever make a meaningful bond where they can begin to understand the subtext of people's lives? Because it's understanding the subtext where you can make healing contact with people. You can't do it by procedures. Medical training now often destroys, and not just medical training, but medical management subsequently, which is, in a sense, the continuation of the training, the monitoring and so on, drives all that stuff out. In the end, I mean, when it comes to this enormous organisation that you fled from and I stay in,
I have jumped the ship.
I think that it is going to need enormous forces to change what is happening. It's a bit like trying to stop the Vietnam War. The economy is so tied to it. There is so much invested in it now, it's very difficult to turn it around. I don't have a quarrel with the technical aspects of the NHS. Anything that's to do with machinery or technology or science is pretty good now. It's the human connection and understanding that has become so impoverished. It's care, not treatment, that is imperiled. Thank you.